we all ready then? Praise God. Well, let's come along this morning to another characteristic of ethics then. Christian ethics. Their emphasis is positive. They're comprehensive. They touch bases in all places. They're possible. He hasn't put something before us that we can't live, but he expects us to totally line up with what he said. Our last one, the fourth one, was that the only focus is Jesus Christ. Since it's Christian ethics, we'll have to follow the founder of the system then. Christian ethics is the system of the ethics of Jesus, of God, of the Bible. That does not mean that we can't look at and learn from others that may be older in the Lord than us, but it's, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, be imitators of me, even as I also am an imitator of Christ, which means it goes back to Jesus still as focus, either way you look at it. He's always the focus. He's always the focus. And so we come to another characteristic this morning. I don't think we'll be able to get through it in one teaching this morning. We'll look at several different aspects of it, and it's the following. Christian ethics is not a manual of rules. Some of these things, you'll see how they swallowtail with one another because we've dealt with them in some manner or some method in the past. But these things are so important, they do bear repeating. Christian ethics is not a manual of rules, but it's a system of eternally right and moral principles to guide your life. So this is a characteristic of ethics. Most of your other systems have a little creedal formula, a rule book that comes along with the system, and the Old Testament, of course, is not excluded. There were, how many commandments? 10. They're known as the 10 Commandments. So it was a system of rules, where you've got a rule book, a manual that you follow. And most of your forms of ethics, of doing right, of morals out there, I'm speaking now of the speculative form of ethics, most of those have little rules and little laws that have been laid down that you're bound to, that if you measure up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however far it goes, if you measure up to that, then you've lived up to your requirements in morals and ethics under this system. I'm going to show you how that's not true. It doesn't matter what system you're a part of, and it certainly will not work for the Christian system. Let's assume for a moment that we had, well, you know how broad the New Testament is, so let's give ourselves room, 754 rules or commandments in the New Testament. We're going to see through this study that you could perform all 754 and still go to hell, still not be right in the eyes and in the sight of God. Now, you can use words like rules and laws, things like this. You can use words like that in several senses. So let me give you the sense that we're going to be using the word rule or commandment. I mean, I guess a rule and a law and a commandment would really be all the same thing. That is, they're setting forth something that you have to obey. Well, what's a principle? Can you violate a principle? Well, no. But does that make a principle a rule? Well, it depends on your definition of the terms, and it really depends on how you use them. Remember back to the very first characteristic of ethics. A lot of things really aren't different between the Old and New Testament, but the emphasis is different. And whenever you change the emphasis, then you change the whole mode of obedience to whatever that law, Old Testament was, or principle for the New Testament. So it makes all the difference in the world. Now, in the Old Testament, or it could be in the New, it depends on how it's used, a rule or a law, or the law, capital T-H-E-L-A-W, speaks of a binding, threatening obligation. This is how we're using the term. Because you can't disobey the principles, but just because obedience is a prerequisite in the eyes of God in fulfilling His principles or commandments, whatever you want to call them, doesn't turn it into a rule or a law, as we'll be using the term. A binding, threatening obligation that holds even the best man's conscience in bondage. And that doesn't matter whether you perform the deed or don't perform the deed. You see, I said that it holds even the best man's conscience and the best conscience in bondage. And you'll see as we go through this study, I don't know how far we'll get this morning or what we'll touch on, what we will not, but Paul sets forth the idea that even whenever he was obeying the things that were commanded of him from the Old Testament, his conscience was still bothered. His conscience was still in bondage. Even though he was obeying the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 commandments that have been set forth. And he's the one who goes on to show what a predicament that put the Old Testament believer in, and that's why he warns New Testament believers about being caught up in this, is that even when you've performed your duty, your conscience, your mind still will not give you any rest about that. Now, if you're like that, then you're living by laws and rules and commandments and not by principles. I mean, if you're like that right now here in this church in your life, that even though you've performed the deed, your conscience won't let you rest. It's still bound in some manner. That means you are performing a deed because this obligation is a binding, threatening one to you that holds your conscience in bondage no matter what you do. You see, Paul sets forth times where he was obedient to the outward letter of the law, and yet his conscience was still not satisfied. That's why over in Hebrews chapter 9, conscience is one thing that happens to be mentioned by name there as being sprinkled by the blood of Christ. Because otherwise you can just do and do and do and do. And there are a lot of people like that. They just do and do and do and do. But they're never satisfied. And worse than that, they still feel guilty. Even though they've done and done and done and done. They still feel guilty. So, you see, over in the New Testament, Jesus said, this is my commandment, that you love one another. But that commandment, the use of the term commandment, or rule, or law, is not like it is in the Old Testament. Now, you see, the words are the same. Of course, you got Greek and Hebrew, but I mean, the basic meaning of the word is still the same. But one is used under law dispensation, and another is used under grace dispensation, which is really what we're going to be speaking about this morning, because the difference between the two, law and grace, is found here in our fifth characteristic of ethics. One is controlled by a manual of rules, and another by eternally right and moral principles. With the manual of rules, you're bound to do. You are bound by the rule to do the action. So you can call it the action rule method. With the motive principle method, which is what we're speaking of concerning principles, you are guided to choose. One is bound to do, another is guided to choose. And that's why we have to go before actions to find motives that are based not upon laws, but upon principles. So whenever, and I'll show you this hopefully at the end of the message this morning, where over in the New Testament we don't have any laws, no commandments. Now I'm using the term as I just defined it. Jesus said this is my commandment. So obviously we have commandments, but it has to be interpreted properly. It's not the binding, threatening obligation. It's not that. I don't care whether he uses the word commandment or you are forced to do this or bound to do this or whatever. It's not the same as the Old Testament. It is not a binding, threatening obligation that even after you've performed it and performed it well, even the best man's conscience is still held in bondage. We're talking about a different system, a different way of life. So let's look at this rule book mentality for a few moments. You see, the Ten Commandments were a legal code of conduct for Israel. And there is no parallel for the Christian in the New Testament for a legal code of conduct. Now there's a parallel if you want to study morals, and that of course would be Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. You can compare the morals and the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll be doing in a later message, which is the chief moral section of the New Testament, would be the Sermon on the Mount, with the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5, which set forth in no uncertain terms the high morality and way of life that God expected of Old Testament Israel. So only the comparison could be drawn that, well, here we have New Testament morals, there we have Old. But I'm saying that there is no parallel, none whatsoever, in the New Testament for the Ten Commandments, which served as a legal code for Old Testament Israel. And that's because of this fifth characteristic that we're giving you. Christian ethics is not a rule book system. Now, denominationalism might be a rule book system, but Christianity, Christian ethics, is not a rule book system. And its difference, in contrast to the Ten Commandments, can be seen in the fact that when you think about this, it's true, no number may be attached to the principles, all of them, of Christian ethics. What were the commandments for Israel? What were they called? The 10. He tells us how many, the 10 commandments. Now, we're going to be looking at some of the broad general principles of ethics later on, but there's no way that you can figure out a number like they did for 10 commandments and attach that to the New Testament form of Christian ethics. Just think of all the different things that we study. You know, that would be an easier way, and a lot of people would like that, is, study things, 10 things, 15 things, however many things that are required of us, study that. But you think back over the years, even though we study one particular principle that's required, you can never say enough about that. And sooner or later, another teaching is dovetailing with that teaching. And you're learning more about that first teaching from the second one that you got. Well, if it was a system of rules, we'd just list the rules and talk about that subject until it was exhausted, and we would forever be done with that. But have you noticed in our teachings that it's impossible to forever be done with anything? It can be a little frustrating if you don't let it be enjoyable, because you think, oh, we've studied this before, I should know this by now. Well, you can know a lot about it, but because it's a principle system and not a rule system, principles are so broad. A rule just says, thou shalt not do this. And you take the surface interpretation of that, and you're through with that matter. You've already completed that. And I'll be showing you this before we get through this morning, but for the principle system, the principles are just so broad that one is swallowtailing here and another is dovetailing there, and in between the gears are meshing together. And the more teaching that you have, the more these things tie together. And the more that you see, it's impossible. It doesn't matter how long we stay around or study, it's impossible to come to the final end of all of the principles for Christian ethics. It's impossible to. For the 10 Commandments, you had 10, and that was the moral code of law for Old Testament Israel. But for the New Testament Christian, under grace, there's no set number of do's and don'ts, or thou shalts and thou shalt nots. The New Testament simply does not have a rule for every situation in life. And neither does it have a principle that specifically speaks to every case. For Old Testament law, for the most part, that was true with how God was leading them. But even Old Testament Israel had her problems because too many times she went by surface interpretation. And sometimes surface interpretation won't give you all the answers that you need because you don't have enough laws that have been stated, whether you're talking about the heart of the moral law, the 10 Commandments, or maybe some other laws that help to explain and define the 10 Commandments, which is what the rest of the Pentateuch is all about. Even if you've got that, then until you see some deeper meanings, you're not going to get the full interpretation out of that an individual needs to have. So let me repeat, the New Testament does not give a rule for every possible situation, neither does it give a principle. We've said before that in the life experiences of people, many times you study through that and you gain all types of insights and principles in how you should conduct your moral life, even though you're not at the place or in the situation which is exactly identical to what they were in. You can still see principles of faith or principles of praise or principles of love or principles of forgiveness or some principle found there even though you're not in that situation. And there's one good way that the Bible's been set up so that it can answer all the questions of life. Another way is these broad principles that Paul gives. Sometimes they're summed up in just a few words right in one verse, like avoid the very appearance of evil. Now, what does he tell you to avoid there? Well, he doesn't tell you, except whatever appears to be evil. Well, there's nothing that you can just say, well, here's evil, like, that's 4 feet tall or something. You've got to apply that to all different types of situations. Does this appear to be evil? Does this have the appearance of evil? Amen. You see, that's not a commandment. That's a principle there. A commandment you have to be able to reduce to something you can add 1, 2, and 3 up and end up with some understandable answer. Now, I know I've got to go with my body, with my legs, with my mouth, with my hands, whatever, and go do this. We'll be showing you that later on. But a principle says avoid even the appearance of evil. A principle will tell you to give no occasion to the flesh. Now, what does that mean? He doesn't tell you what you can't do, except in a general principle, don't give an occasion to the flesh. Would it be all right, Christian teenagers ask, to sit in a car and hold hands and maybe kiss on one another's ears? Well, are you giving an occasion to the flesh? I would say that's an occasion. Whether you do anything or not, it's not the issue. It's did you provide an occasion for the flesh to indulge? Whether you indulge or not, you see, here's the difference. The Old Testament, if you didn't indulge, you're okay. New Testament, God doesn't care whether you indulge or not. Did you give yourself the occasion? Then you have violated. Because given right circumstances, right day, you're in the right mood, you would violate that. You would go all the way, or halfway, or however far. That's too far beyond the Word of God. We used to sit back in Bible classes back in Southern Baptist high school days and say, now, is it all right to kiss and neck? The Bible doesn't say that you can't neck. Now, I know you can't fornicate or can't be an adulterer, but what about necking? And you see, whenever you are a Baptist like that, what you're looking for is a verse somewhere. It says, thou shalt not neck. And so you can see the position that I found myself in because I couldn't give them a verse. They were looking for one of the 10 commandments or one of the 34 New Testament commandments. And you can't find one. And you give them a principle, give no occasion to the flesh. Well, he didn't say you couldn't neck. And what I say about a person like that is you're looking for a way out. Amen. If there's even a question in your mind, and you're a true Christian, why not avoid it? Amen. It proves you're not a true Christian. Because what you're looking for, and guess what? Even if you've got laws, you can still find a way out of them. The Pharisees did. They found all types of ways to get out from under these laws. Just kind of reinterpret a little bit here and spice up there and mix these two passages together, and poof, out comes a Pharisaic interpretation of the Old Testament law. So you see, there's what we're talking about. Under grace, we're talking about motives, not actions. I could care less whether you fornicate or not. That's not the issue. It's what's your motive behind the way you dress and the way you walk and all types of things that we're going to get into heavy later on in Christian ethics. That's what it's all about, dear friends. We know fornication is wrong. We're not going to spend time teaching on fornication. Everybody knows that's wrong. But what about all of the things that lead up to fornication? Such as petting and necking. Oh, there's not a verse that says you can't do that. That's right, there's not. But there are some principles that forbid such behavior. The Christian church has really not been taught that because the Christian church is still a Jewish organization. It still is. It's still looking for its Mosaic leader, someone that just thunders the law to them. And it's still looking for its law written with the finger of God on tables of stone. Forget about the passages that say that God's going to write his law upon fleshly tables of the heart. That speaks of writing the motives and the principles, the desires upon the heart. Because you can hardly write all that in stone. All you can write in stone is don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. You can't go into a long explanation or you would have run out of stones, and Moses would have to have a donkey cart to bring them all down the mountain. To say, now, what about this principle and what about this motive? You see, we're giving you, again, some deeper insight to law and grace, to the difference, because people just in the Christian movement today just can't seem to make the right connections and break the wrong ones between law and grace. They generally go overboard in one direction or the other. They head to legalism or they head to antinomianism. Remember, that was Fletcher's claim. That's why he invented the situational response. Because everybody's either an antinomian or under grace there are no laws at all, just none at all, which you pervert to mean you can do as you desire. And then there's the legalist. Oh, laws, yes sir, there are laws. I've got 14 of them at home on my wall, and you have to do those laws there. And that's why we told you there aren't three avenues, the legalistic avenue, the situationalist avenue, the antinomian one. There's four, and the fourth one's the biblical view. There's a biblical view that's in between legalism and antinomianism. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We'll come to that. But the situational response, we've said before, is really nothing but the antinomian response. He does whatever he wants to as long as he can justify it by saying, I'm doing this out of love to my brother. I can fornicate, steal, lie, cheat, murder, anything. So that's not legalism, that's antinomianism. It's really not situational ethics, it's really antinomian ethics, because they do whatever they desire to do. So anyway, getting back to what I was saying, that the New Testament simply does not give us a rule for every situation in life, and neither does it give us a principle. We're talking about principles, so you say, well, I know no rules, but what about 44 principles? No. It does not give us a set number. Only when you're going by a rule book can you have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only when you're going by a rule book can you have numbers. When it's not a rule book, when it's the law of grace written upon our hearts, then there are no numbers, there are no specific rules and principles, so that if we know those, nothing else is needed, because these will cover all areas of life. It just won't work. You see, one of the mistakes of the Pharisees, we spoke of them a moment ago, was that they tried to expand their knowledge of the character of God into a religious step-by-step manual. And that pretty much is what people are trying to do today. Well, what do I know about God? Well, all right. Now, on the basis of my knowledge about God in this area, then I can deduce 4 laws from that. They try to expand their knowledge of God's character to a religious step-by-step manual. That's what they were trying to do. Because there were places even in the Old Testament where a particular law didn't speak to an issue that you need to have answered. And so they tried to expand the laws that they did have based upon their knowledge of God into a religious, it wasn't spiritual. Because really they came up with answers that they were comfortable with. They never invented new rules that they didn't like. Or of course if they did, they found some ways to circumvent even those. So it wasn't something spiritual, it was a religious step-by-step manual. Let's take a few moments out to look at some of the faults and the shortcomings of the rule book system, to show you why this is not applicable for Christianity and the Christian form of ethics. It just won't work for the following reasons. Faults and shortcomings of the rule book system. We're just continuing to go over this same broad, general topic, law and grace, Old Testament, New Testament, rules, principles, bondage, liberty, and so forth, to make sure that you have this down properly in your heart. But that's what I'm just saying. We have to keep on and on going over it, because you can approach it from so many different angles and explain it in a new way, and it still be the same old thing that you've always been saying. But the more you go over it, the more of the messages and the verses and the concepts dovetail in your mind, the more it's drawn together, obviously, the better you'll understand it. Okay, in the first place, we can speak of the impracticality of having enough laws to correspond to every situation. That's impractical. Even in the Old Testament, they had 10 commandments, and they were fairly broad. But there were just a whole lot of little minor issues that weren't even covered there. Now you think about the New Testament. You think about the situations, whether at home or on your job, that arise, and you think, now, where is a rule in the Bible for this, and you search in vain to find one. It's because life is so complex, it's so complex that it's impractical. A rule book system is impractical, especially in a day and age like ours.
Amen.
When you've got things like nuclear war and all types of things you didn't have back in Bible days. You know, that's why even the languages are different. The Hebrew language of back then is different than the Hebrew language of today, because they didn't have to have words for typewriters and computers and rockets and airplanes and everything. They didn't have to have words for that. They didn't have things like that. And now in the modern Hebrew language, you've got words that correspond to things like typewriters and telephones and big pens, which shows there's been a big difference, which shows that the customs and the culture of today are much more complex than they have been since the world was founded, because there are just so many different situations. I mean, in former times, it's not that sin is any more sin today than it's ever been, but in former times, you basically got up in the morning, you ate, you went out and worked in the field out behind your house, you came home. There weren't movies to go to. Now, is it a Christian thing to go and watch Bambi at the movie house? You know, you didn't have things like that even to worry yourself about. There wasn't anything to do. But get up, go to work, come back home. Get up, go to work, come back home. You didn't have all these questions. You know, there weren't speeding laws. Well, I'm going to go too fast with my donkey today on this road. They didn't have laws like that. We have all of these things now. We have all of these things today that we have to think about, that you're always having to make decisions about. But you see, you have to make those decisions upon your general knowledge of the principles of Christianity. And sometimes, dear friends, you can't even recall a specific principle to mind, except you just know this is something that I cannot do. Or this is something that I feel free to be able to do this. You think about sodomite shoes and prostitute purses. You know, you don't have verses for or against. You just kind of have to draw upon your knowledge of the principles of Christianity. And say, now, would this be allowed or would this not be allowed? And you have to think of things like that. It's impractical, I'm saying, because of how complex life is, to possibly have a list of commandments or rules or principles. It's the same there. But a list of them, when you make a list, really you've gone beyond principles. They've become rules and laws and commandments. So we'll leave it with that. It's impossible to come up with a list that would cover every single possible decision in life. I mean, the Bible is broad. You see, that's why we said earlier, they're comprehensive. We said Christian ethics are comprehensive. They cover everything. But they don't cover it with 74,000 laws that are written down straight in order from Matthew 1 to Revelation 22. It'd be impossible to do that, because somewhere along the line you'd leave something out. You would have left speeding out. It's what you would have left out in the New Testament. They didn't speed back in those days. There weren't motorboats and cars and buses and motorcycles. What about going up in an airplane? Doesn't the sky belong to the devil or to God, one or the other? They didn't have to think about things like that. They didn't have airplanes back then. Can I go to the movie house as long as it's a G Walt Disney movie? You can't go to PGs today. They've got all the foul language just like the R's do. And I'm not saying you can go to G's. I'm just saying there's the question. Can you go to a movie theater and watch, Bambi? You have to start thinking of all different types of things. All right, what if it was the G movie, but what if it was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Well, no, that's occult. I know I couldn't go watch that. What about a good nature program? 100% nature program. Doesn't even have any commercials for Tylenol on it. It's just straight outdoor life. Well, you see, that's something you have to answer yourself. And you won't find any laws or rules for that. You'll have to draw on your, can we say vast? Maybe shallow. I hope it's vast and not puff you up with pride. Your vast reservoir of Christian knowledge. Amen. You have to draw upon that in order to make these decisions. You can't go and look up in a rule book. And you see, this requires so much more out of us. It requires so much more maturity and honesty out of us. Because it's easy to find a principle, a verse somewhere that will tell you that you can do what you want to do. You know that's true. That's easy to do. So it requires more honesty. We see those verses that seem like that it would be okay to do that, which is what the flesh wants to do after all. And yet we see other principles that really speak to our heart and to the spirit. We know, oh, this is what I should be obeying. Now, are you going to be honest and choose the one that you really know in the depth of your heart is what God requires? Or are you going to be self-righteous and self-justified and say, well, I can do this, after all, I've got a verse for it? People are known for doing that. Yep. I don't care what the subject is. Right. So that's why they are spoken of as children, the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and we as the sons of God. Hallelujah. Because it requires, God requires, and this new and living way requires so much more out of us than for Old Testament Israel.
For the continuation of
So that's why they are spoken of as children, the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and we as the sons of God. Hallelujah. Because it requires, God requires, and this new and living way requires so much more out of us than for Old Testament Israel. It would be easy, but it would be impractical to have a rule book that gave us enough laws where they would correspond to every situation in life. Okay, another fault and shortcoming would be the gray area problem. What about gray areas? Even the best of manuals, you see, simply can't cover areas like this. This is why things like the Talmud was invented, was written. It was supposed to speak to various gray areas that weren't dealt with back in Old Testament law, or the Midrashim, or the Targumim, or whatever we're speaking of. These various things were invented and brought on the scene to help fill in gray areas. But you can study the Talmud and find gray areas there. Here's the point, and I don't care whether you're talking about spiritual laws, Old Testament, New Testament, whether you're talking about laws at the job, laws on the books, before the courts, the police, wherever. As soon as you make one law, there is no putting a period to the subject. As soon as you make one. Because then you're going to say, now, what about, you see the courts, they're always pulling their hair out over laws that look contradictory, and so you try to fill in that gray area in between there. And you make a new law. You had one law that was right field, one that was left, now one center. But now you've got space between center and right and center and left. That's right. And so you fill that in. And now you got a space between 3/4 and full, and 3/4 and a half and 1/4, and 1/4 and none. And you fill that in, and you've got an 1/8. You fill that in, a 16th.
That's right. It keeps going.
And it keeps on going. You know, there's no way you could ever fill it in. And I don't care what you're talking about. You can talk about your job. They give you so many. If you work at the plant or the corporation down there, there's a list of rules. You can't do this. As soon as you write one, you have to never put your pencil down until the day you die. That's what it's all about. Look over in Galatians chapter 3. This is what it's all about, because it's impossible. It doesn't matter how good the manual is. It simply cannot speak to gray area problems. It cannot speak to gray area problems. And we're going to use a verse we've used before, Galatians 3 and verse 10, which equates one commandment with commandments to the very end. Ad infinitum, we could say. For as many as are of the works of the law were under the curse, for it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. And Paul is setting forth in the book of Galatians that when you, as a Christian under grace, subject and submit yourself to one commandment, just one law, then you are a debtor to do the whole law. That's his whole point here. Because what they're trying to say is, well, we're not doing all of the Old Testament law, and after all, the part of the law that we are doing, we're mixing with grace and Christianity, but circumcision and maybe a few of those Mosaic rites, we're just doing a few of those. And generally, you just pick the ones out that you want to do. What Paul is saying is that because by nature of the case, these commandments are really one and the same. They're all the same. They're all commandments. They're all part of the same system. He's saying the system of Moses that's been done away with in Christ. And therefore, whenever you subject yourself to one, you can't isolate that from all of the other law and think, well, I can do this one and then not do any others and I'll be okay. No, because that one is a part of the whole, and the whole is part of the one. In other words, when you do one, you've subjected yourself not to one commandment, but to the system of the law. To the system. That's what we're talking about, the system. You see, it's still not valid today as a Christian to tell a lie or to commit adultery. But when you subject yourself to the Old Testament prohibition against bearing a false witness, you have subjected yourself to a system that's been done away with in Christ. As a matter of fact, in 3 places, let's go over those. I've given them to you before. We are told, A, Romans 6:14, you are not under the law. B, Romans 7:4, you are dead to the law. C, Galatians 4:5, you are redeemed from the law. And that is what Paul says. You're not under the law, you're dead to the law, and you're freed, redeemed from the law. Romans 6, Romans 7, Galatians 4. And I think I've said before that you'll go in churches just about anywhere in this land and find 10 commandments tacked up somewhere. Sunday school room, right in the auditorium, the sanctuary. They'll have to look real official in there, back in the children's rooms. Maybe that's some of the little games and little things that are required of all the little kiddies to memorize and write out the 10 commandments. And so we're still bound by those today. And you know, the church always is talking about grace, 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 grace. The church always talks about grace. I mean, they're antinomian in many regards. But they're always talking about Moses' 10 commandments. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. They failed to realize that was given centuries ago. We're not talking about Matthew 20. We're talking about Exodus 20. We're not talking about Acts 5. We're talking about Deuteronomy 5, way back in the Old Testament. And they subject themselves to that and feel justified. I have never put a ski mask over my face and walked into a bank and held a toy pistol on anybody, or a real one for that matter. But yet they cheat on their income taxes, and just about in every other way they steal. Amen. But they think that they're okay in the eyes of God. They run in the store and don't put, well, I know it's just a nickel, a dime, a quarter in that parking meter, but they run in the store and don't put anything in there. You stole from the city. They require your money to maintain meters like that and to keep the streets in condition so you can drive your car over them and all types of things. You stole money from someone. In other words, that was rent. You were renting that spot for a few moments. But Christians don't think anything's wrong with that. They think it's all right whenever you're in a store and they give you too much change back, just to say, well, they charge too much anyway. So I'm just getting even, and really I haven't stolen anything. This boxed up pizza here shouldn't cost $4.53 anyway. And I gave them a $5, and they gave me $1.47 back. So they deserve to lose that extra buck anyway. Well, and you know, they're surprised. I remember several weeks ago, someone gave me a whole handful of too much change, and I was out of the store before I realized it, home. And it was a week before we got back there, and this girl knows me. I'm always in this particular store. And I said, I got a whole handful of change. I don't know what she did. She must have just reached in there and grabbed quarters and everything. Because it wasn't like $1 too much or 50 cents. It was like $1.72.5 too much, you know. She just went through there and grabbed pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters to make sure that I had my change. And I had a whole handful of it. I should have thought whenever I got it, but I was in a hurry. Look at a handful with a whole mound of change there. This couldn't be right. But I got home and got counting all that up and had way too much change. I mean, like $1.50 too much change back. So I went back in there. And I said, you know, you gave me too much money back. Oh, she said, you mean I shortchanged you? I said, no, you overchanged. You gave me too much. You know, they can't believe you're going to bring them money back. They think you're in there to complain and get some money from them. I said, no, I'm not here to get money. I'm here to give money. She said, we couldn't have done that. And I said, but you did. And she said, well, I guess you're telling the truth because you wouldn't want to lose money telling a lie. And I said, well, that's real bright. That makes a lot of sense. And she said, are you sure you want to give it back? And I said, I'm positive I want to. So I gave her $1.50 back. But you know, we taught you that way back early in the Sermon on the Mount. But you probably have done it before that time, hopefully not since then. You just keep the money. Who cares? They gave you too many of whatever it was you ordered. You just keep it. You don't contact the store and say that you sent too many sweaters out or something. We ordered a big $1,500 new copier to do our tapes for us. The other one was getting old and rusty around the gills, I guess. We needed to get a new one in. And they sent us one that got damaged in the mail. Now, it's really nice. The $1,500 copying machine, duplicating machine. It's got all types of buttons and things that you push on it, and it had been damaged in the mail. The back of it, the back frame of it had a little, well, not too big, but it was noticeable, a dent in it. I saw it whenever I got it out of the box. So I figured, well, I'll use it anyway. As long as it works, I don't care whether it's banged up or painted purple. I really don't care as long as it works. So I plugged it in and started working with it, and it didn't work. It recorded half of one tape, and then another one it spewed out, another one it would record, but wouldn't rewind the thing. So we went through several months worth of negotiations trying to get that shipped back to them. And it was supposed to go back to the place that made it down in Georgia rather than the place that sold it to us down in Texas. And I don't know where it ended up. I think it ended up down in Georgia. And anyway, the people in Texas realized that we were without one now and that they owed us one because we'd already sent them $1,500. So they mailed us one. And I got that and got it out and been using it, and it's been working fine. And then we go along about a week, and here comes our repaired one from Georgia. And you think, well, they'll never know. The one in Texas thinks the Georgia people sent us one, and the people in Georgia think the Texas people sent one, so we'll just keep both of them and either sell one and make $1,500 or use one until it burns out, and then we'll have another one. So, no, I knew we couldn't do that, but I didn't know who to call. I didn't know which one to send back. So I just decided to stick it in the house and leave it boxed up, and we'd wait. And praise the Lord, we had to only wait a couple of days. And the Texas people called us and said, I hear you've got 2 of our copiers now. And I said, yeah, what do you want us to do about the other? They said, well, we'll send out a call tag, and they'll be by the house and pick it up. That way I don't have to do anything about it. But the thing is, what you would do if you were a typical church member is you'd lie and say, oh, no, I never got the other one. When those people called you, you say, well, no, I never got yours. I got the other people's. And you'd keep them running around long enough until you had sold one, made $1,500, and moved from that address. But, God requires total honesty out of us. But you see, what I'm saying is, in the gray area, you'll find some of these commandments that won't touch little things like that, putting money in the parking meter or whatever, because that's a broad part of the teaching about being sure that you're truthful and that you're honest in all areas of your life. So the gray area problem. The courts are all wrapped up in this. As soon as they make a decision, they have to reverse that because that violates another one, and then they wonder, well, what about this case? Because now this is one that we haven't had before, and there are all types of gray area problems, all types of them. Well, let's move along to another fault or shortcoming, and that is the fault of legalism. Lists, by nature, inevitably produce the misuse of them in arguing over 3 things. Here's what lists do. And you see, most of my discussions that I've had, even with some of you, and hopefully your mind is redeemed and it's saturated with grace, so we won't go through this anymore, but I can remember back in the early days of the church, most of my discussions with people in the church, and I guess most of the people that I had discussions with aren't here anymore, so that said something about them. They were looking for a way out. But my discussions were, well, can I do this or can I do that? Most of them were. Is this a law or is this not a law? What can I do here? What can I not do? Most of my discussions were in areas like that. And what you're doing, you're reducing principles, commandments, it's really commandments, to legalism. And these lists, whether you're talking about 10 or 1,000, lists inevitably produce by their nature. Just because you've got a list of things you can look at on a paper and start comparing them and contrasting them, lists inevitably produce the misuse of them in 3 areas. Number 1, additions. Number 2, subtractions. Number 3, interpretations. You've got 17 commandments on your list, but all of a sudden you think of some more, and so you start adding to it. Or you've got 17. Remember the Pharisees did that. They added commandments. Oh, it's not lawful according to Moses' law to heal on the Sabbath day. Well, where's that in the Old Testament? Where's that in Old Testament teaching on Sabbath observance? It's not there. But whenever you've got a list, if you're of the right mind in this area, you're just itching to make additions to it. And then other people, or it could be you, and now you found one on your list you don't like, now you revert to subtractions of your list. You see, what I'm saying is when we have no list, there's nothing you can add, there's nothing you can take away. See, we can't add anything to Christian ethics because we don't know what the last number was. As soon as you know what that last number was, you say, well, I'll add another one. This is quintillion and 1 right now. Or subtract or interpret. What people like to see is printed out on the page before them 10, and they start contrasting those to end up with their interpretations of what these commandments really say. Let's go back to the 10 commandments, and I'll give you an example right from the 10 commandments. Now, there's an unmined depth in the 10 commandments, which we're not trying to get into. But we look at them as most people do with surface interpretation in mind. What about verse? Well, we'll start with the first one. We're talking about lists inevitably produce interpretations. And the interpretations either go beyond or come short of the commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, does God only mean, in stating Exodus 20 and verse 3, that you can't serve the god of Amalek and his wife, you can't serve the god of Babylon, you can't serve the god of the Phoenicians, you can't serve the god of the Egyptians, you know, these various gods that have names? Is that all that he means? Well, that's the way the Jew would interpret that. And the Jew would leave things like covetousness, leave things like self-esteem out, because that's not included in surface interpretation. Although, according to New Testament teaching, these very things might be a god. And I guess the biggest one of them all would be covetousness and money. Now, is money included here in verse 3? Well, not according to rule book system. Verse 3 says, don't have any gods. We know what a god is. Ishtar, a goddess. We know what gods and goddesses are. So there's surface interpretation that would bind you to a certain form of interpretation so that you wouldn't see the true essence of what's being said. And thus you end up with legalism. These 10 commandments, as well as other Old Testament laws and commandments, were abused by the religious leaders who turned them into legalism. Now remember, legalism is not a law. A lot of people have misunderstandings in their mind over legalism. Obviously, Joseph Fletcher would be the head of the pack. He thinks that as soon as you say, well, now, God says in his word, lie not one to another, Colossians chapter 3. When he said lie not, now, wait just a minute, that's a legalism. Because sometimes it's necessary to tell a falsity so that we can help someone else out of a situation. So they're equating a law with a legalism. And a law is not legalism. A principle is not legalism. Legalism is a wrong view, a wrong mental attitude toward a law, which generally produces wrong actions, which we entitle the misuse of the law. That's what a legalism really is. It's a wrong attitude toward a law. You get so bound up by a law. We're not saying that you're bound up so that you don't violate it if a situation came up where you could violate it, because let's assume we're talking about one of these eternal moral laws of the Old Testament where it's not valid for you, whether old or new, to ever violate it. So you say, well, it sounds like the same either way we go to me. No, we're back to emphasis. We're back to the binding, threatening obligation of it as it exists as law, which, as I said, holds even the best conscience of the best man in bondage. So there is still a major difference either way you go. You end up in legalism with the ritual supplanting the right. You can put ritual in, but not have the right attitude toward it in your heart and be violating the very thing that God set forth. So if the ritual supplants the right, then you have legalism on your hands. Now, the New Testament is entirely anti-legalistic. Romans 6:14. But it's not anti-legal. And you can put a little star or a smiley face or whatever you want to there and say, see notes from maybe next week. We'll give you a verse for that. The law of the New Testament is anti-legalistic. Romans 6:14, but it's not anti-legal. We use the term legalistic and legal to try to make a distinction. But you could use the term legal and legal. The New Testament is anti-legal, Romans 6:14, but it's not anti-legal. But by that, when you use the word legal again, now you mean it in a different sense, different emphasis, different sense. So they'd be contrary rather than comparable to one another. But I'll stay with legalistic and legal so it doesn't sound like confusion. To say the New Testament is anti-legal, but it's not anti-legal, produces confusion unless you put a definition of how we're using the term legal in each one of those cases. So, Romans 6:14, Paul says, you are not under the law. And he means not under the law in its legalistic sense. Not under the law in any way, of course. Not under the law in any way. But the way that you're under the law, the only way that you can be under the law is the legalistic way. There is no other way. I just have said that these lists inevitably produce the misuse of them, which is what legalism is all about. A wrong attitude toward the or a law, which generally, not always, but if you give the person enough time, is extended from just a wrong attitude to the misuse of that law. So Christian ethics has to balance law and grace. That is, the distortions in the popular mind of law and grace. And by that I mean the following. Christian ethics has to guard against the perversion of law, which is legalism, and the perversion of grace, which is antinomianism. Christian ethics has to balance the distortions between the perversions of law and grace, legalism, and antinomianism. Because you see, apart from grace, well, the law leads to three things. It leads to legalism, it leads to idolatry, and it leads to self-righteousness. The law, you can do all those commandments and feel so self-righteous and justified because you don't sense the inworking of the Holy Spirit who gave you the ability to perform the law. You can sense that in New Testament dispensation because the principles and the things that are required are so complex that it takes the help and the grace and the advocacy of the Holy Spirit in order to perform it. So the law leads to legalism, to idolatry, a worship of the law as law instead of the giver of the law, as well as self-righteousness. Now, after saying all these things about law and grace, legalisms and liberty, I'm not speaking of some mystical leading by the Spirit as to what you feel is right. People say, well, we've got no laws, We don't have a system of laws. We don't have a system of rules. So what am I supposed to do? Just go by what the Spirit is telling me? No. That's a small part of it. But we're not talking about just some mystical leading of the Holy Spirit, because the New Testament itself doesn't leave us just with abstract generalities by saying do right and don't do wrong. It's broken down into many, many different absolute principles that I break down into two different categories, the broad ones and the narrow ones. You see, even though we're not bound by law in any form, in any wise, in any fashion, we still have to have absolutes to tell us what's right and what's wrong. And these absolutes must be dependable, they must be understandable, and they must be realizable. And so the New Testament does give us principles in two categories: broad principles and the narrow ones. Let's look at some examples of this. For instance, in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, here we have a principle. You see, the New Testament does tell us what to do and what not to do, but it's with a different emphasis and in a different degree than does the Old Testament. So it is full of principles. Now here's a broad principle. Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye. Here's a commandment to do. But what's he telling us to do? Well, he doesn't tell us that. That's what I mean by a broad principle. He doesn't tell us. Except to say all things that you would that men should do to you. Well, what's that though? You see, the Old Testament wouldn't give you something like that. It would say, now here is exactly, we're going to look at that in a moment, here is exactly what you must do. No deviation to the left or the right. And here you're kind of left on your own, and you're, as we said earlier, that broad reservoir of Christian knowledge that you have. Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Go back to, for instance, Matthew 5. Verse 7. Blessed are the merciful. That's a broad principle. Because when and where and how and to whom do you show mercy? Well, he doesn't say that. He just says, if you are merciful, you'll be blessed because God will give mercy to you. Or, you see, we could go on and on and on. We're just looking at the ones that I can see here. What about verses 13 through 16? Here are some principles. You're the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Well, what's that mean? What have you said after you've said you're the salt of the earth and the light of the world? Well, not much as far as commandments go, because I don't understand that when it comes to commandments. But when it comes to broad principles, I kind of know what he's talking about there. And you see, being the light of the world, that can include all types of things. Amen. All types of things. Of your righteousness and your holy life. And your pure life that you have to live, because that's what light is. Light is pure. It's good. It's right. It's holy. It's righteous. You know, it's clean as compared to darkness or a flashlight that's fading away on old batteries. That's not what he calls us. A fading away flashlight, but you're the light of the world. You're like a city that's set up on a hill. And you know, you can see that for miles and miles around. Even if it's not set up on a hill. If it's a big enough city, I'm talking about a metropolitan area, which they didn't have in days when Matthew 5 was being spoken and being written, that is in Palestine anyway. These big 10 million people population centers, well, you can be miles and miles away from that out in the dead of night, and you'll just see the whole sky lit up and glowing before you if you've got the right atmosphere because of all the street lights that are on all night long. We could go outside our home out into the Delta and look 20 miles north where Memphis was. You could close your eyes and spin around in a circle and open them, and you could tell which way was north. Not going by the stars, the dead of night. You knew which way was north. Look for the lights. And as soon as you found the lights, assuming you could see them on that night, and I mean, you couldn't see a particular light, but the whole sky was lit up. Well, there's north. And then if you're really bright, then you can find east and west and south once you found one of the directions. Although some people can't. Oh my, they find north, and well, where's south now? Generally, they know where south is, but which way's east now? Found north. Do we all know how to find? Well, we won't get into a class on geography, but I'm amazed at some people. You can show them the sun, and it's early in the morning. But what direction is that? They don't know that's west. Just think if you were awake. They wouldn't know. Some people wouldn't. Well, maybe you're not a very good light on a hill. Or maybe we're glad you're the light and not darkness trying to get to the light. You'd never make it there. So here are these broad principles. Verse 15, what's he mean here? Now, we're not a light. I mean, my face isn't shining like a 100-watt light bulb here. Neither do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a lampstand, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Well, we aren't lights. Unless someone's getting a vision of my face shining like Moses or something. But I can still see the page. I don't see my face in the page. I'm still seeing verse 15 there. So what's he mean by this? You're a light. Well, that's a broad principle. It's a broad principle. You know, you are a place of safety and security so that all the people out there on these stormy seas of life know how to get back to safe ground. And you know, you get all types of analogies and comparisons out of that. You're like a lighthouse that's on an island so that you're surrounded by a world of darkness and people cast upon the stormy seas. And what are you founded upon? The rock. And what is the rock? Jesus Christ. So you can get all types of Sunday school lessons out of that. But you see the point of what's being said without being told, now live a good life and don't smoke or cuss or chew or go with women who do, because people are watching you. He didn't have to say that. He just says you're a light. So is a light going to smoke and cuss and chew and go with women who do when everyone else does? Then who's going to be attracted to you? That's the point. No one's going to be attracted to you then.